Evening, everybody. I'm Diane Sayre, independent candidate for U.S. Senate against Schumer in 2022, and this is the New York Symposium that I am hosting along with Dennis Speed, my co-host, who is also the leader of LaRouche's Manhattan Project. And we're joined tonight by John Droz, physicist and founder of the Alliance for Wise Energy Decisions, and I'm really glad to have him with us. He will give the main presentation. We have a video from Sue Wood, who's a town supervisor in Hopkinton, New York, where they successfully defeated a wind program. Bruce Todd, who's a retired millwright and activist, former candidate for US Congress in New Jersey, who worked on the 4 nuclear power plants there and also 3 Mile Island. And Gary Kanitz, my campaign manager from upstate New York, farmer in DeKalb Junction. So I'm just going to say a couple things and then turn it over to John. First of all, Lyndon LaRouche, my mentor, used to talk about, he changed the idea of talking about infrastructure. He said, you say infrastructure and people think of a thing. They think of a port, they think of a bridge. They don't think of platform, which is really the word, what he wanted to get at. And if you take something like the huge brawl that Franklin Roosevelt had about the Rural Electrification Administration, because Wall Street said, yeah, fine, you can electrify the cities. That's not very expensive. People live close together. You don't need a whole lot of wire to connect one residence with the next. But why do you need to electrify the farms? You're going to have 40 miles of copper wire just to get to one farmhouse. This seems like an exorbitant expense. Really doesn't make sense. We shouldn't do it. But of course, what happened when you had electricity in the farms is that suddenly the ability to produce was increased by orders of magnitude, because using light, you could get the chickens to lay more eggs, you could refrigerate the milk, you could store your food, you could wash your clothes and dry your clothes in electric washing machines, so that human labor was greatly increased in its power in the universe. And it's that idea of platform. It's not a thing in and of itself. And for this reason, LaRouche vehemently opposed things like the now no longer existing, thankfully, North American Free Trade Act or Free Trade Agreement, because it's the same issue that if you take a company that's operating in Michigan and you have a highly skilled workforce, an educated workforce with a good health insurance plan, people working 40 hours a week, the quality of product, the quality of work going on at that plant is going to be very high, and the people working there will be able to afford what they're producing. If you take that plant, that same plant, and you ship it down below the border to Mexico or off to Bangladesh, where you have child labor, no environmental regulations, people are not educated, they don't have health care. Well, what happens to the product? It becomes shoddy, the population gets ground up, the population becomes poorer in the United States. Sure, the owner of the factory might get rich in the short term, but the way LaRouche explained it was that the productivity of the planet as a whole had been weakened by that policy. And I would say from that standpoint, if you look at the planet as a whole today, the enormous disparity in vaccine distribution, the fact that you have 270 million people right now threatened with starvation, these are not matters that people in the United States can afford to ignore. And I wanted to have this discussion about energy tonight because we just had something happen in Texas. And I wanted to invite John Droz to speak about what he's been working on for many years. I think he's one of the most knowledgeable people in the country on the question of wind, on the question of energy policy, energy grids. And I'm not going to say more about that right now. We'll open it up for questions later. So John, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you, Diane. Let me start to see if we can switch over to screen share here. Okay, everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Good. Okay, well, thank you very much, Dan, for having me, inviting me here. I am somewhat knowledgeable about this issue, which I'll explain in a minute here. So most of the times I give a talk, I have a prepared script, since I tend to maybe wander, or else, since I'm a senior, forget what I'm going to say. So today I'm just going to sort of go with it, and we'll see how many times I make a faux pas. I like sayings by some other interesting people, and I think this has a lot to do with what we're told about energy matters, since we're talking about energy here, that a lot of misconceptions about what's the facts are in energy. So me trying to straighten people out sometimes is a surprising challenge. So this is what I look at as far as our challenges tonight. First of all, we have a topic that I'd say has extraordinary implications here to us as a country, us as individuals. Problem is, it's a technically complex topic, and well, the charitable way of saying it is most people are technically challenged, and they just don't understand a lot of details here that when you get into that kind of stuff here. So unfortunately, people's eyes tend to glaze over when you start talking about kind of stuff. So I'm trying to keep it tonight where it isn't too technical, so we'll see. A third challenge is whenever you speak about these things, you have an audience with wide, diverse scientific background. Some people may have some technical, some people have zero. So to have something that everybody understands and not bored by is a challenge. The bigger problem, I'd say, is that most of the public has been exposed to a significant amount of misinformation. And so it's challenging to overcome that misinformation in a short time period, which is my last point here. We have a very limited time here. So here's another good quote that I like from another one of my favorite people, Winston Churchill, who has a lot of good insights. So this is my objective here for my talk tonight here. So here's the outline of what we're going to do. I'm going to have a few slides about me. Then we're going to talk about some basics about the electric grid from a layperson's perspective. Third of all, what really happened in Texas. Fourth of all, what we can learn from this, because there are a lot of lessons there. And then I'll answer any questions you have. So you can post these in the chat box or whatever. I'll give you my email at the end. You're welcome to send me an email as well. So here's the quickie part about me. I'm a scientist, not a public speaker. That's what this is supposed to say, a physicist. So I have given a lot of talks, but ultimately I'm a scientist here, not a professional speaker. So just take that in mind. I am from upstate New York. This is where I spent most of my time in Birmingham Lake. This is Lewis County, sort of roughly between Utica and Watertown. I still have a summer home there, so I'm a big fan of the Adirondacks, and this is in the Adirondack Park. So one of the great things about New York State has a lot of wonderful natural resources. It's unfortunate that the politics aren't consistent with those, but what can I say? The Adirondacks is a wonderful place. It's one of the outstanding places in the world. So my undergraduate degree, I had a BS in physics and BS in math, 2 degrees from Boston College, which I really liked. Still go back periodically, so it was a wonderful school. My graduate degree in physics was from Syracuse University. And then I went to work for General Electric in Utica. aerospace electronics, a really quite interesting job here where they're making computers for military, like space computers and military planes. A fabulous job. But my objective, starting in my early 20s, was to retire when I was earlier, because I was always an outdoor person. So my goal was to retire by the time I was 40. So that's another whole talk. But I started investing in real estate as early 20s, and because I worked at it, I was able to pull the plug, retire from a management job at GE at 34. So I've been retired since that time. Now my 75th birthday is coming up in a week or two. So 40 some years I've been retired. So the question is, what would I do with all this time? So this is what I decided, that I would share some of my knowledge and interest. And most of it was in these three areas. I call the three E's: energy, environment, and education. They're all quite intimately connected. And I've added a fourth one now. I should have put on there. The fourth E is election. So I've been involved quite a bit on election integrity issues. So 4 E's is what I'm primarily involved in. And of course, all this work I'm doing is for free. Nobody's paying me. I do it because I think it's a worthwhile thing to do. So in the process here, with the last several decades, I've given probably 200 talks, a wide variety. This is just a few little sample snapshots of some of the talks I've given in multiple, probably 10 different states. Major talk to the U.S. Congress, several talks to North Carolina state legislators, where I'm now a resident of. So a lot of talks on a variety of subjects, those 4 E subjects. And because of that being somewhat high profile, I've been, you might say, somewhat targeted. So you can say, well, what do your enemies or your opponents, let's say about you? Well, an interesting study done by the Sierra Club, this is their national organization. They were concerned about saying, why aren't renewable energies, particularly wind energy, being implemented more quickly in the United States? What's the problem? So they did a 25-page study into what was holding it up. And so rather than wading through the study, you can see here was their final page. They said there's 2 obstacles to wind energy implementation in the United States. One is the Koch brothers, and the other is this John Droz guy. Well, I know who the Koch brothers are. I've never dealt with them. But it was sort of interesting for me to be put on the same level of influence as the Koch brothers. The other interesting thing I think this says is that the Koch brothers have influence because they hand out a lot of money. Well, I don't hand out any money. All I do is provide education. So effectively, even though they don't say this in their report, what this is saying is that education actually is as influential as money. So I think that's sort of an important takeaway from what this is saying here. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about me. Same, you know too much already. Okay, second part is we're going to go into what are some basics about the grid here that citizens ought to know. All right, here's some overview points here. The U.S. electricity grid, number 1, has been called the world's largest machine. So a lot of people probably even look at it as a machine, but it is. Second of all, it's an engineering feat of Herculean proportions. Third of all, provides us with light, heat, and other modern conveniences. Fourth is it's functioning 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And lastly is probably one of the most important things that separates us from third world countries. Something you don't think about, but believe me, if the power went out in the United States here, let's say across the country, within a couple of weeks, not months or years, within a couple of weeks, we would be a lawless place, and we would have a lot of similarities to third world countries. And the longer it went on, the worse it would get. So it's the type of thing we sort of take for granted and don't much think about, unfortunately. So I'm going to list a few key facts about the electric grid. Maybe you know these, maybe you don't. So, but you need to know all of these to be able to make some informed decisions about what we need to do going forward. So one thing is the grid has to be balanced between supply and demand every second. not every hour, or every half hour, or minute, every second, or a fraction of a second, actually. So that's an important thing here. So some people say, well, okay, can't we store things? Well, no. There is no storage of electricity of anything meaningful. They've tried to do that, but it's extraordinarily complex. It's extraordinarily expensive, and actually, it's extraordinarily dangerous. Friend of mine who's a pretty sharp scientist said, actually, a real world for a better word for a battery storage that's like for a wind project. When they have that in a few buildings, he says the better description of that is really it's a bomb, because all it would take is a small type of problem, spark in the wrong place or whatever, where what's being stored in something like that here would have extraordinary explosive force. So there is no storage of electricity on the grid of any consequence, and there isn't any to be likely to happen in the near future, despite what you hear. Fact number 3 is, up until recently, our system, our grid, was based on the fact that we had full control over all of our electrical supplies. In other words, we could change their output by turning a dial or something of that nature. So that was very important. So if we needed more, we turned the dial up. If we needed less, we turned it down. That worked perfectly fine. So that's what's changing here. With fact number 4 is that with wind and solar, we have almost no control, as there is no dial to change their output. I can't go to a wind project and say, give me 20% more power there. No, I can turn it down, sure, but I can't turn it up, which is the important thing here. So I have no control over the output of a wind project or a solar project. That's a profound difference in what we have set up here. Profound difference. Fact number 5 is the U.S. grid has been a phenomenal success because 24/7, 365, it provides us 3 things: plentiful, in other words, adequate, fully the amount that we need, reliable, and affordable electricity to 330 or so million users in the country here. Again, if you go to a third world country and see, none of that's true here. It's not plentiful, it's only in limited areas, it's not reliable, and it's not affordable. So we take it for granted, unfortunately. Fact number 6, an integral part of supplying low-cost, reliable electricity is that the grid operator has a built-in safety reserve. And that's typically 10 to 15% of the current demand. That's a very important point here in this whole thing. We're going to talk about this a couple times. So, but this is built in. So they don't have the demand met exactly by the supply. They have the demand met by supply plus a reserve. We'll explain what that is in a minute here. So the safety reserve is for 2 situations. One is when there's unexpected changes in demand. They have a pretty good idea of what the demand curve looks like here, but things happen. All of a sudden, there's, I don't know, heat wave or something else. A lot of people turn on air conditioners, stuff like that. Things change here that may be out of the ordinary on the demand side. And they can also have unexpected changes on the supply. So a facility, a gas facility, coal, nuclear, or whatever, could have some downtime here that's unexpected. Fortunately, for our traditional sources of electricity, the downtime is very small, very small. So that's rarely the case. So usually the supply safety reserve deals with changes in demand. So what is our supplies? Talk about electricity supplies here. So these are all our sources of electricity. So the main ones we have, of course, are nuclear, hydroelectric, coal, gas, wind, solar, and then odd and end things like geothermal or things of that nature. But those are the major sources of electricity we have today throughout the country. Different states have a different proportion of these things. What constitutes our demand? So when I say demand, I mean all users of electricity. So that would be home use, retail businesses, hospitals, municipalities, industries, military, et cetera, you name it. All sorts of sources all sorts of users that need electricity. Okay, so we're going to try to see if we can understand. I'm going to start something in the super simplified say. So let's say this blue 3 boxes here are our demand for 3 different days. So you see the 3 days there, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Now, in actuality, the demand For some grid we're talking about here, the demand is not a straight line. It goes up and down. But I'd like to start just with the real basics, and then we can move into the more accurate thing. But let's just say that this is our demand here. So for those 3 days, we have a set steady demand. So we have to meet that. So here would be a commensurate supply curve to go with those 3 days of demand. So I've broken it out into the major things here. So I've simplified it, saying, let's just assume that each of these 3 sources are providing the same amount, 20%. So we have coal providing 20%, nuclear 20, hydro 20, gas 20, and wind 20. So that would meet our supply here, and all would be well. So the only problem with that is that the wind part on there is completely inaccurate. So what do I mean? Well, I can produce a gas of 20% across those days. I can produce hydro. I can produce nuclear. I can do for coal. As I said, these are controlled. So I could produce that 20% amount across those 3 days. But for the wind, I cannot, because I have no control over the wind here. So the wind is going to go up and down based on nature. And so there's no way I have any control over what it is. So that's what I'm dealing with. So if I'm trying to match this to a demand that's equal, I'm not going to be able to do it, because every time the wind goes down here, there's going to be a shortfall. So what has to be done is to fill it in. And the only source we have to fill it in is the same color there, is gas. None of these other sources respond. You see how wind goes up and down fairly rapidly? Those are steep things here. So hydro, nuclear, coal cannot respond. They can't crank up or down their facility fast enough to match the speed of the wind changes up and down. Here's a technical point. One of the reasons that wind is different from solar and anything else here is that their output, their power they produce, is actually proportional to the cube, key word, the cube of the wind speed. So in other words, if the wind just changes a mile or 2 an hour, it has a very significant change on the output here, much more than you think. It's not a linear basis. It's a cube relationship. Anyways, to meet the demand of the original blue box we had on here, this is the only way it could be done. We could have a fixed set of coal, fixed nuclear, fixed hydro, fixed gas, but then wind would have to be complemented, augmented is the word I use here, with gas. So the way of looking at that is that the wind and gas are actually a pairing. And just like in a dance partnership, when one person steps back, the other person steps forward, and so on and so forth. So it's a pairing. So we got to look at that and have an understanding that wind plus gas is what we actually have on the grid. Otherwise, it makes no sense. The grid would not operate without something augmenting the rapid fluctuations that wind energy has. Okay, so I said the original box here was a simplification. So here's a more accurate picture of what a demand graph might be over a period of time. Okay, so this is more technically correct. Now, the next thing we would do is say, let's break that down into components here. So I'm going to break it down here. So we have now in color here. So what we're trying to do is meet this demand curve by providing 4 different types of electricity, not sources, but I don't know, I'm missing here, I forgot the word. But there's 4 different elements of this that that combine together. So the bottom part that's in the darker is what's called base load. That's fixed. So we have something that just continually provides a set amount of electricity 24/7, 365. So typically that would be nuclear, or that would be coal. But nuclear does a good job of that. So on top of that, there's daily fluctuations here. And that's what these green like sine curves are here, because the amount of power demanded or used by users changes. At night, it's less, for instance, than in the day. And there are certain times of day that are more. So maybe at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, there's more of a peak as everybody goes home and turns on their TV, air conditioner, whatever. So the grid people know the typical shape of the curve, so they plan for that. So that's the green part. which we're calling load following here, if you look at my little chart there. Then the third type that comes into the picture is spikes. So these would be unexpected changes here. So I put a few of those on symbolically. So those are, what I'm saying is unexpected variations from the normal load. And the last thing is we have to have this grid safety margin, which we said was like 15%, something like that. And that has to be above all of these things here. So that catches these variations. And as you notice, though, even when there's a variation, that safety margin has to go up beyond that and protect from another one from happening. So that's a fairly technical chart here. I've simplified it a bit, but which is pretty accurate as to what's going on in the grid here. Okay, so we notice how that the grid safety reserve easily handles the unexpected demands here. As I said, there's a couple of jumps there, and it also handles any unexpected supply changes as well. So the question will be is which of those elements, those four elements we have here, is wind suitable for? Well, number one, the base load, of course, is 24/7, 365. So no, wind can't provide base load of any kind. It goes up and down to zero. Load following, well, that would mean it would have to follow the load changer. So no, wind can't provide load following either because it's not controllable to follow the demand curve. Peak load, well, same thing. If all of a sudden we have a demand, a peak that says I need, 50 more megawatt hours here of electricity here, we just can't call up wind and say, send that down. Who knows? They may or may not have anything available. And of course, they can't provide the grid safety reserve either because that is something controllable. It has to follow these other things here. So the bottom line is, once you look at it from this point of view, wind energy is not suitable for any of the elements of the grid. So what do they do with it? Well, what they do basically is that they throw it in and say, okay, let everybody else work around that. Well, that's beyond ridiculous, but that's literally what happens. All right. So there's my message about it. Wind is not suitable for any of these type of things here. Okay, so that's all. That was my simple explanation of the grid here for lay people. Hopefully it wasn't too bad. So now we're going to look at what happened in Texas. This is a simplified understanding somewhat too, because it can be complicated. Now, here's a chart. If you've been following anything here, this is a technical thing. We'll simplify it a bit, but this is the official position from the federal government, the U.S. Energy Information, EIA, showing what was the supply curve here over the time here. The time there was the blackouts was off to the right here. So this is their official chart here. So I'm going to simplify this chart a little bit here. So first of all, I'm taking off some of the headings, stuff like that. Second of all, I'm going to combine all the things that aren't renewables into this gray area. So we're going to call those fossil fuels plus nuclear, which might be called traditional supplies. So now you see above here, the renewables are either green for wind or yellow for solar. So it should be pretty clear as to how much the renewables are contributing here, right? Right. Okay, so there's three things though that this EIA chart doesn't show. Number one, it doesn't show the demand. This is a supply curve. It doesn't show how the demand fits in with this supply. Second of all, it doesn't show what safety reserve is involved here. It isn't breaking that out, and it doesn't show the wind augmentation part that they've allotted for it. So we're left to guess on those type of things here. So let's look at each of these separately. So the first is, where is the demand curve? Well, our assumption would have to be that since there weren't blackouts, the demand curve was met by the supply here up until it got over to the right side here. And then that's where I put the black part there, just estimated, sketching it in here. That's where the disparity happened, that all of a sudden the demand exceeded the supply. So it happened over to the right here of our chart here. Well, it doesn't show the safety reserve. It doesn't show what I'm calling wind augmentation. So I'm saying if we took a part here off to the left here where it was sort of relatively stable, that would be, this is before some of this cold spell happened. So this would be somewhat normal operation. So there should be a safety reserve that's not showing on here of 15%. So I'm putting that little bar there for blue. And there should be a wind augmentation amount as well that would equal the wind supply. Like I said, the dance partnership, if ERCOT here, the grid manager did this right here. So they would have an equal amount of gas on standby to match the maximum amount they would expect from wind energy. So I gave you the line size here as to what that would be. So the point is that if we added those two things up, if they were set up properly, we would then see here that here's where, over on the right here, I'm saying this is where the grid was in trouble and the grid manager was trying to throw everything they could find at it, but clearly it got to the point where it wasn't enough. But my point of the other two is that if those two, the wind augmentation and the grid safety reserve, were actually dedicated and set aside in that grid, even the highest amount of electricity demand that they showed here would not have been a problem to meet. Wouldn't have been a problem. So the fact is, it was a problem because they don't have these things set aside here. So that red part particularly has not been set aside. They cheated. Okay, our last part is say, let's look at what are some critical thinking ideas here that we may have concluded here because of this. Lesson number one is that wind energy needs 100% backing, not 50%, not 10%, 100%. And the reason is because wind can go to zero. In fact, it typically does every day, zero. Without 100% augmentation, wind energy will steal from the safety reserve, and that should be illegal, quite frankly. They've let wind do that in other states, but that's primarily because the amount that they steal is low. Maybe they steal 5% out of the 15%. Well, nobody even notices, but that's what happened in Texas. Texas has a larger amount than the 15%. So now, all of a sudden, now they notice. Number two is wind energy's backup is usually gas, because that's the only source that will match its ups and downs speedway. Remember, as we said, wind and gas are a partnership. Number three is because of the gas requirement, wind energy is not a CO2-free source of electricity. So that's a pitch that the lobbyists are making here. And we need to counter that every time when they say wind energy is CO2-free. No, that's a dishonest characterization. Wind energy is not a CO2-free energy source because it has to be matched with gas. Number four is because of the gas requirements, wind does very little actually about dealing with climate change. So they say, well, we need this for climate change. Well, there's no scientific study ever, any place in the world, that has shown that wind energy has a consequential impact on climate. Zero. Number five, wind and gas can surprisingly produce more CO2 than the gas by itself can. This is a heavy one to think about. The wind plus gas package that's normally existing can provide more CO2 than just if you had gas by itself. Well, that's for a technical reason, but we don't have time to go into that. But just take my word for it. Six is that there are surprises. This is another surprise. There are also scientific studies, numerous scientific studies, that have concluded that wind energy actually makes climate change worse. I'll show you how to find that out in a minute. Okay, here it is. I put together this report that has 50 plus studies. These are all scientific studies, places like Harvard, MIT, whatever. And they are about these prior items we just talked about. Why gas produces less CO2 than wind plus gas, why wind energy is adverse to climate change, stuff like this. So 50 plus studies are cited in this report here. So it's on my website, or you can send me an email and I'd be glad to send it to you. Lesson number 7, nuclear is far superior option for addressing climate change than wind energy. Here we are, common sense. Number 8 choices, most of what you see in mainstream media about our energy option is simply inaccurate. So, number 9, our energy policies are written by lobbyists and are devoid of real science. Number 10, we are witnessing an epic battle between science and political science here. That's really what the fight is all about. Science versus political science. So even though a lot of these things sound good, these are 2 more quotes. Oh yes, Winston Churchill. However beautiful a strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. Duh. One of the great mistakes is to judge policies and programs by their intentions rather than their results. Okay, so see much more about all this at my website, wiseenergy.org. Sign up for my free energy and environmental newsletter. We have over 10,000 subscribers at the moment. Think you'd find it worthwhile. So thank you for listening to these matters. Hope you've given some critical thought. I'll be glad to try to answer some questions. Here's my email if anybody wants to send me an email here tonight, tomorrow, whatever. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. Also, I myself have some questions, but we'll wait on that. Now, just for people watching, you can put your questions in the chat on YouTube or the chat on Facebook. Jenny Burns is looking at those and she'll get them to all of us. Now, let me just ask again, Jose, did we get the video from Sue Wood, or we don't have that?
I have not received anything so far.
Okay, so I think what I'm going to do is go to Gary Kanitz, Bruce, then Dennis Speed may have some things to say, and then it'll be open discussion. Gary, why don't you go ahead? You're muted. There we go.
My computer's fighting about the unmute button there. Okay, so well, I just had a couple of observations of a few things going on around here. They're not specifically wind related, but just on the more general question of the grid, and then I kind of have a question or two to put to Mr. Droz. By the way, I just really appreciate everything you had to present and the clarity of that and your willingness to be here and share that with us. So actually, if we could get the graphic, I want to talk about just this solar plan that's up here. That yellow area there is about 961 acres spread between 3 towns, Brazier, Messina, and Norfolk. That's where actual solar panels are intended to be built and fenced in. They are in turn enclosed in broader areas that make up a total of 2,232 acres. And this is a project that's ongoing. This image you're seeing is actually from a foam board type display at the Brazier Town Hall. So it was just a photo that my wife took of that. The output of this project is planned to be about 180 megawatts. So you can see that's not exactly consistent with the land area being taken over to do this. There's a series of ongoing squabbles over the plan is to try to get the project in the building phase by 2023. One of the things that's still being discussed is the issue of the tax incentives for the companies doing this, because they're planning a pilot program where the companies basically make a payment in lieu of taxes. So they would not actually really be being taxed in real time based on the assessed value of these plots of land. Those kind of programs are intended to promote programs that actually create jobs. That's the purpose of the pilot incentives. This clearly doesn't do that, because you need a very small crew, and it wouldn't necessarily be jobs from this area anyway. So I wanted to point out those things about this particular project. One of the towns, Brazier, has actually already opted out of that element of it, of the tax diversions. At the same time, just to give you an idea of the kind of money they're pouring into this, the plan is to be leasing this land from the current owners at the rate of $1,000 per acre. per year. So there again, that gives you some kind of sense of the magnitude of tax value that's being deferred for the purpose of promoting this agenda. So, so I wanted to just put that out there first. And now I had reviewed a video presentation earlier by somebody who I've heard Mr. Droz is not particularly fond of, and I'm after listening to him, I'm not fond of him either. That's Richard Kaufman, who's the energy secretary to Cuomo, and just a couple of comments on him. Yeah, and I would like to hear what you have to say about him, or these couple of these particular things he raised in what he was presenting. One thing is he specifically is targeting the fact that the transmission lines, according to his data, he's claiming are running at about 54% capacity, so that with the purpose that the reserve capacity is there to transmit additional power in times of increased load and things like that. And he's basically arguing that this excess capacity shouldn't be there. It's a waste of money. It's creating an additional cost for the consumers, that they're paying for it all year round and they only need it here and there. So obviously he must have something fishy going on to try to address that. What happens when you need it and you don't have that capacity? Now, one other element of that I want to put out, which is kind of more on a policy side of the thing. The proposals he's putting out are basically all oriented around further deregulation of the system, which, side comment on that in terms of the Texas situation, that seems to me to have as much to do with the problem as the particular energy resources they chose. Because like the shortfalls in emergency cap and the supplemental gas that you're pointing out need to be there, I mean, part of the reason that's not there is because all of this is being done in a deregulated way by private businesses just trying to do it from a profit motivation standpoint as opposed to an energy security standpoint. And that's essentially what he's saying we need to do here is make the system more like a business. Take each of the elements that are normally pass-through costs of energy production and figure out ways that the energy suppliers and the people running the grid can profit off of that, rather than the small the margins they're getting now, which apparently is just based on how much they invest. They get a certain percentage on that, and so anyway, I don't want to go down that road. But you see what I'm getting at there. So he's attacking the surplus capacity, which is required for security in the energy supply, and he's saying we need to further deregulate and make this more profitable from a business model standpoint. But now here's where it gets takes on another color, in my opinion. All of his proposals are oriented around bringing in everything from wind to solar to wave models, but it's all renewable oriented, which are very low energy density resources. But I think it kind of gives the lie to that agenda that, oh, this is just for profitability and efficiency and cost savings, when you look at the fact that, as you said, nuclear is a far superior option. And if he was just interested in a business model that was going to be profitable, there's no reason you couldn't address everything he's saying needs to be addressed by building that instead. And so I think this really, we need to include looking at this as a attack on advanced industrial society in general, and really an effort to limit population growth and standards of living and things like that too. That's clearly an underlying motivation for this. Otherwise, if they were just interested in doing what's profitable, they would be going with a solution that's meaningful for improving the human condition. So and then there's one other specific thing he said, which you may not want to address, and that's fine if you don't. But it was kind of a mystery what he was getting at, because another element that he's mentioning here, and it may be a little off topic, so feel free to ignore it if you want, is that he's proposing the layering of an IT network on the grid system. And while he mentioned this several times and he said he doesn't know how it's going to get done, he's insisting that it's essential to do it. And it's really not, I mean, clearly he's a spokesman for another policy agenda, but it's really not clear what that agenda is in that particular element of it. But I think the other questions are more interesting, particularly also how you would compare the problem of these solar systems to everything you said about wind, because it's a little more predictable than wind, but it's still, it's got its own set of problems, which I'll leave it up to you if you want to enumerate that. So that's what I have to say. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, maybe John, if you want to respond, and we'll just open it up for Bruce and Dennis as well after you share your initial thoughts on what Gary said, since it was directed to you.
Okay, well, I can't give a full answer here because we don't have enough time tonight, but anything that Kaufman says here, he's a political appointee, so he's just following what's politically correct. So New York State has lost its way as far as energy policies, and my belief is that that science exists for one reason, and that is to give us answers to our technical questions. And what should our energy policy be is a perfect example of a technical question. So the answer of what our policy should be rooted in science. But there's nothing to do with science in New York State's policies. Instead, New York State energy policies have been 100% written by special interest lobbyists. And these people have no interest for the public. They have no interest for small businesses. They have no interest for the military. Across the board here, this is mostly about virtue signaling. So most of it is just baloney. So that's the simple answer, it's baloney. Now, as far as what the people in Messina, et cetera, ought to do, they ought to look at my website, and I have a page dedicated to solar and explains the whole thing, is what the problems are. And that's one of the things I've gone to a lot of trouble to try to help people on the grassroots level. So what they need is a proper solar ordinance, quite frankly. And in my view, the number one problem with solar is the well-documented fact that there are significant carcinogenic materials that are in these panels, and that there's a high degree of likelihood that they will outcast, get down into the ground, into groundwater. And of course, all these people are going to deny this, but on my website, I have clear documentation that is the case. I think the problem is sort of what's happened with, let's say, smoking. There was scientists knew for a long time there was problems with smoking here, but the industry was in denial about it, and tried to produce counter studies and all this kind of other stuff to obfuscate the issue. So that's exactly what's happening with wind and solar here. That the problems are obvious to anybody who's looked into it. Wind has been around longer, so there's more studies about the wind problems. Solar is sort of newer, you might say, less mature. So a lot of the science hasn't really caught up to it. But the number one problem, in my view, here, if you want to say what ought to be in their ordinance, is to have protections against carcinogenic materials like PFAS, Gen X materials, stuff like this. Look it up. They're all on my solar page there and my wiseenergy.org website. And I would say the best movie to watch about this, I think sometimes seeing somebody else say it, is this movie called Dark Waters, which is almost exactly on the same topic. It's talking about DuPont and people like that, but it's talking about the same chemical families that we're talking about here, PFAS and whatever here, that are the problem. So these things are horrifically bad. And anybody just watching that movie, and you can see how the industry in that movie tried to deny it. They lied about it. They made all sorts of obstruction. So you can say that's exactly the same thing that's going on with solar right now. So That's the shortest 2 cents I can say about that.
Great. Bruce. Oh, Bruce, you just muted yourself.
Okay.
Right.
I want to pick up a little bit on the last discussion we had, because obviously we were talking about the shutdown of the Indian Point nuclear power plant, and we're continuing to see this kind of event going on across the country. I happened to watch yesterday the Senate hearings on the resilience of the grid, and Michael Schellenberger brought up in his initial presentation the fact that despite what occurred in Texas, what occurred out in California with last year rolling blackouts and brownouts, there's still a move, two things. One is the move towards decommissioning of nuclear power plants, shutdown of coal power plants and gas plants, and at the same time, a huge, even despite what happened in Texas, a huge continuing push towards what they call renewable energy. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. I have a house in Florida, and I just got the electric bill for that. And there was a little offtake of that, and I clicked on it for what are we doing around energy? And in the case of Florida Power and Light, they apparently are going to continue to push solar. In fact, they say by the year 2030, they will have installed 30 million solar panels across Florida. Maria Cantwell, the senator from Oklahoma, when she gave her did her line of questioning, she also brought up the point that despite what happened in Texas, the ERCOT has in their plans 96% of all the projects that they list for development is wind and solar. Nothing about nuclear, coal, gas, anything like that. 96% is what they intend to spend on wind and solar in the upcoming period. And you see this, as was brought out by Michael Schellenberger, the three most dangerous from the standpoint of energy areas of the country are California, the Texas or Southwest area, and New England, where they're continuing to push the so-called renewable energy. So as I had pointed out in the last presentation, initially we had planned as a nation to build somewhere on the order of 250 nuclear power plants, and we never got probably any farther than about half of that. And that also, the abandonment of that showed that there was no actual commitment for a trajectory of increased output as a nation, as far as our industry, our agriculture, global trade, all of those things. And we've seen that. We've seen the results of that in our cities and in our states across the country. So I think it was very important that there were a lot of things brought up, and there was believe me, a lot of pushback on the question of the reliability of nuclear, coal, gas, over the whole issue of continuing to push renewables. I think I'll really leave it at that. I don't know if John had a chance to watch the hearings on the grid. One thing I would say about the grid itself, besides the fact that we need more energy production, is I believe the American Society of Civil Engineers said that it would take something on the order of $2 trillion to actually upgrade the grid to the level we actually need. That's not even talking about energy production. So I think I'll leave it there for any comments John might have or any questions that other people have. Okay.
Good. Okay. I know a bunch of questions have been coming in, and Dennis may also have some things to say. And I do think, I understand we have the video from Sue, but maybe we'll show that in a bit, because I'd like to have a little discussion. And that means we're going to end up probably going till 9:20 or so, 9:20 or 9:30. But Dennis, do you have thoughts?
Well, there were some things that were addressed to John, so perhaps the best thing would be to go to them. So therefore, I'll just say a few things. It's relevant to understand that when you're talking about New York State, you're talking about New York State and New Jersey for that matter. You go back to 1980, 81, when a process began, which was exemplified by the destruction of the Shoreham nuclear plant by Mario Cuomo. But it was a thing that was being discussed more generally in the aftermath of the takedown of New York City in 75, the so-called financial crisis, and then the imposition of something called the Municipal Assistance Corporation, Big Mac as it was also referred to. It's a 33-year charter. And what was happening was that they were planning for the future of the area. And in that future, there was not only depopulation, but it was specifically the notion that industry was going into, we were in a phase where we were shifting from sunset industries, meaning steel production, coal production, heavy industry, auto production, and so on, to sunrise industries. And these were supposed to be the new technologies of computers and so forth. The idea was that all of a sudden what was going to happen is that everything was going to shift to the south. We were going to have in Texas and in other parts of the southern states, this was the new era. And there was going to be a shift in the demographic pattern, and many other things were planned and proposed. And what was said was that within no more than 2 decades, by the time we got to the year 2000, there'd be a complete miraculous shift in the consumption level and the efficiency and the beauty of American life. And everybody was going to be really happy with this. We're 40 years on with that hoax. And what you're looking at here with respect to this issue of wind power in particular is a perfect example of this. We're talking about clearly no future projected for the primary cities of the United States. If you take the case of New York City, which has been at more or less 7.5 to 8 million people, give or take, since 1957. There's no notion that there should be any sort of growth, whether that be in New York City or in the environs, which is based on advanced industry manufacturing. Where once upon a time, back in the 1960s, mid-1960s, the largest number of manufacturing workers in America were located in and around New York City, not Detroit. The cities like New York were built on industry and on trade and commerce. And that, for that matter, even agriculture was very important. So the question I think I have, which I'd like John to address, because he made it very clear that you're talking about a war between political science and physical science. And I understand what he's done with this site. But when you're looking at things like the clear intention to dismantle the grid, and you've given talks all over the country, what can you tell us about the response, not so much just of the people that have come to your talks, which is one thing, but also the response of people in industry, persons that should have some capability of doing something about this? What's your sense of where we stand in the country in terms of this moment? Obviously, we've heard recently about a lot of people, or several states, 14 states, talking about challenging some elements of these policies. But what's your sense of where we are in that battle?
Okay, well, first of all, let me answer Bruce's question. I did not hear the Senate testimony here, but I do know Michael Schellenberger, and he's the person who's on the right side of the issue. So I'd be pretty confident in most of the things he'd say as being credible. As far as your questions here, excuse me, that's a good question. I personally, my sense is that we are going through a substantial era of the last decade or two of indoctrination, and that this is reflected in education. If you go into schools, stuff like this here, I'm a big person who believes that critical thinking is probably the number one thing that should be conveyed to a student, but the very opposite is happening. Students are being taught to effectively be robotic, and so there's very little thinking. In fact, the average person today has difficulty processing much more than a soundbite, and so these people know this, and that's why they've focused a lot of things into soundbite answers, like wind energy is free, clean, and green, for instance, stuff like that. They have a whole series of these type of things here, but that's all aimed at the public consumption. So unfortunately, a lot of businesses have gone along with this because they feel this is the politically correct thing to do. So that's a choice they're making. That was one hope, despite what everybody thought of him, of Trump's administration, is that he was sort of upsetting the apple cart, and that maybe people would all of a sudden become a little more astute and willing to speak up about some of the foolishness that's going on. So that's why, of course, one of the reasons they hated him, because he was exposing some of the false narratives here. So as the phrase I used before, a lot of this is virtue signaling. These people are out there trying to outdo each other by saying, I'm going to do more than you. I'm a better person than you, blah, 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 blah. My general sense is that it's not going in a good direction. And but on the other hand, I'm an eternal optimist, and I think this is fixable. So my last point would be, I think there's two things that need to be done to fix this. Number one is, I see that let's say conservative leaning groups in the United States, organizations, there's an amazing number of these groups. I added them up at one point and came up with a list of 130 conservative leaning organizations in the United States. I'm talking about national ones, not little ones. And but the first problem is that these groups don't work together. They may occasionally talk, whatever, but they don't really work together. Now, if you look at what's going on the left, let's say the Sierra Club, Unit Concerned Scientists, Greenpeace, they actually do work together. They have joint meetings. They come up with plans of actions. They agree on messaging, all this kind of stuff here. There's a significant difference between groups on the left working together and groups on the right not working together, a significant difference. The second thing is communication. Same disparity, that people on the right have little understanding of what I would call public relations or more sophisticated communication. But the people on the left, they are significantly more advanced. Just look at the language. They have infused in our language dozens and dozens of propaganda things here, just like we're talking about tonight here. Wind farm, that's an example of phrase. They just coined this phrase because they knew this was an industrial complex going in the middle of a rural area, and they knew that wouldn't be acceptable to most people, so they had to remarket it as something that sounded benign, pastoral, whatever. So wind farm is what they come up with. That wasn't any accident. There's dozens of these things here they've done. If you look at what's done on the right here, almost none. So it's number one, we ought to know when we're using these terms. Like, you won't hear me say wind farm other than explain like this here. I've extracted it from my vocabulary. So we ought to know when we're being manipulated here and not be using the words of our opponents here. So that's where my hope is. And I am working with some organizations. For instance, like I'm working with Heritage right now that's committed $10 million just this last week to do something about election integrity. They're the first group that stepped up and actually put money on it and said they're going to do something about it. But I've been working with them behind the scenes. So there are some indications. I think we can wake up and start doing things before it's too late. But there's a lot of impetus in the other direction that isn't so good. So it's hard to say what's going to happen, but as I say, I'm an optimist.
Well, what you're just saying, I do want to bring up, and Dennis might have more to say about this later, on this coming weekend, March 20th and 21st, the Schiller Institute is holding an international conference. And on Saturday, the Saturday panels it's online, 10 a.m. till 1 p.m. and 2 to 5. And then Sunday, the same schedule. But the first panel is going to be on this question of culture, and not just what people think of classical music, the year of Beethoven, which it is and very important, but what has happened to people's ability to think, and what were the interventions? One of the presentations will be about Dante, who made a powerful intervention. It really created language, in a sense. After he died 700 years ago this year, and you had the Black Death in the 1300s. You had horrible circumstances, but what was the power of poetry? What was the power of these things to lift people out of their current circumstances and be able to think creatively? And I think one of the most devastating things, I find myself thinking here, because we were sort of joking before we started that you're not supposed to say bad things about windmills. You're not supposed to say things about what happened in the elections in 2020, that there's censorship. And the part of the censorship is, once you stop saying things, then you also stop thinking things. And you get very narrow and conformist. So that was one thought I had. The other thought I just had on this energy question, you had brought up Bill McKibben and his use of the word modernity as something that he was opposed. And I do think if you look at, I believe we had 104 nuclear power plants. We've shut 2. I guess we're bringing a couple online, but we're somewhere. So we didn't even get to half of the 250 that Bruce was talking about. And you simply cannot have growth, and you can't even have the standard of living that, frankly, we should have in this country. That it's a natural thing for human beings to increase their energy consumption per capita. That's a natural function of development. And it's become almost an ingrained axiom that no, consuming more energy is wrong. And what all of us should be doing is trying to eliminate our quote unquote carbon footprint. And we should get smaller and smaller and consume less and less. We're living too long. We should have physician-assisted suicide. It's really hideous. And imagine a 6-year-old child being told that the world is overpopulated and they're polluting the planet. What kind of impact does that have on young people? No wonder the suicides are increasing, and drug use and so on. So I think that I'm saying it in such a way that makes it seem like a kind of a gigantic blob of problems, which I'm not meaning to do. But if you have a sense of mission, if you change the way that people are taught about man's relationship to nature, man's relationship to the universe, then things can fall into place, I think, fairly quickly and can be changed fairly quickly. But you have to have this mission, and that requires a certain quality of leadership. And I think therein was the real threat of President Trump, for example, is willing to think that way and express it.
Diane, you want to try to go to the questions at this point? Is that probably the best thing to do?
Sure. Yeah. Why don't we do that?
Yeah, maybe the best thing we can do.
You know what? Before, I just should say, because Sue Woods was good enough to put together this video, but we've just had a lot of trouble editing it to make it work. So what I'm going to do is actually post it later in the comments of this video and post it on the Facebook page with this video, so it will accompany it. And I want to really thank her for doing that for us. But go ahead.
Well, yeah, I think what we'll do is read the 3 questions we've got right now, or we have other questions actually, but we'll go with these, and this way we can take them up as a whole. So we have one question, which is from Richard. He says, I saw an article from AP that said there was a computer glitch that told the gas generators to not turn on when they should have. I presume that's about Texas. So that's obviously John can address to you, I believe. We have a couple of other questions. Howard asks, how does the censorship on social media work? Will there soon be censorship or hostile pop-ups against the tax on wind or solar power? Okay, so, and that's that question. And then the final question was, where can we find this information in order to share with others? I think we've heard that already from John, and maybe we'll say more about that on our side, Diane. But because obviously we have our own pamphlet, The Great Reset, and the great report that's come out. So let me sort of, where would you like to start? You want to start us off, or you want John to start us off? What do you think?
John or anyone can jump in.
Okay, as far as the AP here, the AP is an incredible source or a non-credible source, I would say, to begin with. So anything you following that, I would be skeptical of. But as far as I'm working with several people in Texas, I'd say anything's possible, but I'd say that's, I haven't heard anyone there, and I know some state legislators and some people in the, the grid, whatever, and no one said anything about that to me. So I would be somewhat skeptical of that. As far as will there be censorship or hostile pop-ups against the tax on wind? Well, yes, there are some already here, because this is looked at as a virtuous thing to do. So anybody who's anti-virtuous obviously needs to be stuffed. So that's really part of the irony of what we're involved in here. This is where we have a fight, in my view, also of traditional religious perspectives here versus secular religion. And environmentalism has actually become a secular religion. So these people feel the same way about it as if you went into a Jewish temple and said, well, Moses never walked on the Red Sea or something of that nature. They'd be offended and have a great deal of, they'd be upset about it. So I don't buy into those type of things. These are virtue signaling, as I say. So I'm a science person, and we should be able to talk about things as to what the science says. So I don't know if there's any other questions that I missed there that would address to me here. My website is wiseenergy.org. And I gave you my email, aaprjohn@northnet.org. If you want to get the free newsletter, which is extraordinarily popular, just send me an email. It's free.
Good. Bruce, you have anything you'd like to add at this point?
No, again, I would just like to say that when they did the hearings, there was a lot brought out. I mean, when you mention about what happened in California last summer, or what happened in Texas, basically, it's the universe giving people a slap in the face to wake them up about how critical the energy situation and the economic situation is, both domestically and globally. I would advise people to look at this hearing that occurred yesterday on the grid and on the push for replacing of any kind of stable energy with non-stable energy, which is really what wind and solar are. Okay, and if anybody wants to add to that.
Sure. Gary? I think you're still muted. Okay.
Yeah, I was working on that. No, I just wanted to come back. It was actually something Mr. Droz said, but I wanted to kind of just restate it or re-emphasize it in the context of, LaRouche was always referring to the concept of energy flux density. And I think part of what Mr. Droz presented, gets at that in a very specific way. This point that the power production needs to be synchronized with the consumption by the second. And this really brings home, if you have something like, we have Alcoa here, we have the Corning Canton plant, where they're producing things like the they used to produce the space shuttle windows. They made the lenses for the Hubble telescope and things like that. You can't have industries with that level of intensity of consumption of power without having correspondingly intense resources for producing the power. That is a real time situation, which I really appreciate what John said on that, because it was something I understood, but it brought a whole different kind of level of insight into it when you think about it that way, because it has to be in real time. It can't, people think about, well, you can accumulate enough solar power to do equivalent things. You can accumulate enough wind power. You can accumulate these lower energy density. But even in gas and coal and those kind of things, they're really not even remotely comparable in terms of the energy density that you have with something like nuclear. So I think it's important for people to think about. If you're going to have a real advanced economy with the sorts of space age technologies and production capacities that we have, it's at our fingertips if we took the initiative to really develop it. But the only way that kind of thing works is, you have to have the energy density at the point of production of the energy so that it reaches the point of production in real time. And I think that's, just to emphasize that point for people. So yeah, that's what I have to say. If he wants to say anything else on that, or anybody else does, or
Diane, I think
one more thing on that, Gary, and John may want to say something, because this whole question of regulation or not regulation, look, we had Enron in whenever that was, 2000, they finally went bankrupt in 2002 or something like that, which we know was making up stories about why they had to shut down part of the power so they could increase the price tenfold. We just saw this in Texas with this company called Gritty, where people were saying people have automatic payments set up, so they had a normal electric bill of $133 a month, and in 1 week suddenly they're charged $9,000 that's coming out of their bank account. So this idea of measuring things, supply and demand, or this kind of thing, where you have something that is a life and death necessity, there has to be a certain kind of regulation. And I think also that the people playing these games know what they're doing. You could have, I'm sure they've done it, simulated studies on what happens if a city, a major metropolitan area with a high standard of living that's used to having electricity 24/7, 365, doesn't have electricity for a week. What kind of things happen? What do people go through? What happens when food spoils, when medicine can't be kept, we saw already in Texas, at the last I heard, 44 people died. It's probably was higher if they found people who were alone or whatever, from freezing to death, carbon monoxide poisoning. Maybe people burned down their houses trying to stay warm. There are very real effects in this. And the idea of making a profit, deliberately inflicting harm on people to make a profit, I think is something particularly despicable.
I just wanted to say, in terms of John's point and what Gary was just saying about this idea of instantaneous correlations between supply and demand, think about it from the following standpoint. You have societies which are undergoing development and change, which is not mathematically discernible, because you have changes in the technologies being brought online, which are more advanced than what's, let's say, normally available to the power grid. Take, for example, something like petawatt lasers. Okay, no, these are very advanced and so forth, but we're talking about capabilities of applying energy measured in billions of seconds or femtoseconds, things where the notion is that these are processes that can work so efficiently that there are frontiers in physics, frontiers that we find ourselves on the verge of exploring. Now, there's no plan that would be foreseeable to integrating them into the present electricity grid. That's not what I'm saying. But if your electricity that you're powering your society by is not completely reliable, I mean, the big change, of course, that happened with electrification is look at what happened to the workplace. You could actually work all night. You have electricity, you had electric lights. You could do all sorts of things with inside factories. It completely changed the cultural relationship to time and space. So the thing that's being done in part is a kind of a return to a dark age. In fact, a new dark age, which is not like the one that you had before. And it seems to me that everybody in this country, everybody in the world, but everybody in the United States, that has a sense that they don't want that to happen in this country, has got to be awakened. I think that this kind of presentation we heard tonight is very helpful for that. And maybe what we can actually see, because after all, people are fighting to keep the various nuclear plants open and other things. Maybe we begin to see a certain resurgence of interest in being responsible to know these things and to do something about them.
Good.
My 2 cents, Dennis. Thank you. I agree with everything you said here. My other caveat would be that I tend to think a lot of people that I deal with are good people, and they sort of believe that their opponents are basically good people here, and that there's just a simple misunderstanding here. I really don't think that's the case. After doing this for 40-some years here, that these people definitely have a different agenda. They aren't going to come out and say it, but their agenda quite clearly, if you look at the results of their actions here, is that they're anti-American, quite obviously. They people like Bill McKibben and whatever, who are some of the leaders here, have specifically said or indirectly said in their materials that they think we'd be better off if we reverted to an agrarian society.
Mm-hmm.
So they aren't about saying let's have more modern conveniences. No, they aren't about having more people having a better life or any of these type of things. They're thinking we're going the wrong direction. So that's another whole topic here about how to deal with that. But it's sort of a discomforting development, I would say.
Well, maybe we can have you back to Diane will figure it out, to discuss that other topic.
I'm at Diane's disposal. What can I say?
Great.
Glad to hear that.
Yep.
So is that it, Diane, or you have anything else?
Yeah, well, here's what I'm thinking. Apparently the video from Sue Wood has been somewhat repaired. I think we can sort of conclude this section. I really want to thank everybody, and particularly John. I am so glad to have you with us, and I think we should continue this and have you back on to develop this. And maybe we'll beat back some of the censors, or we'll be on a different platform and be able to let it rip on certain matters. But this has been a great discussion. And actually the last 3 weeks, the one on Indian Point, the one on the Mars missions and space, and this I'm really happy about. I do really want to promote the conference of the Schiller Institute next weekend, that we get the word out on that, because I think it's going to be extremely powerful. It's international. It's being simultaneously translated into at least Spanish, German, French. So that will be effective. And I think maybe I can thank everyone for being here, and we should just go. Jose, do you have that video now?
No, it was repaired apparently, and it's still being uploaded. I don't have it, so I'm sorry.
Oh, well, then we won't show it. I think we'll just conclude and we'll put it in the comments. And I apologize to Sue, but we will make it available to people, because I think it's very important to know that people can organize and win. And even though there is an effort to silence debate by not, I mean, how can you make a scientific discovery if you're not even allowed to have discussions with people who disagree or have differences of opinion. So here is a community that successfully prevented one of these wind farms. I think it'll be very good for people to see, and we'll get that up. But that's
Not a wind farm.
wind. Oh,
And they're not renewables.
an unreliable.
Wind
Right.
project, wind facility.
Yeah, right. Hot air.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking there was a reason why you put wind and gas together, but but a different kind of gas at any rate. Yes. All right. So I think that will conclude the program, and thank you everybody for joining.
My pleasure.
Very good.
Bye.
Good night.